The corner of 5th and Market Street wasn't much to look at. Just another busy intersection in the city where people rushed by with their heads down, lost in their phones or their thoughts. Coffee shops, office buildings, and the constant noise of traffic created the soundtrack of everyday life here. But if you slowed down, really slowed down, you might notice something unusual. There was music floating through the air, different from anything else you'd hear on a typical street corner. Thomas Gray sat at an old upright piano that someone had left outside the subway entrance 3 years ago. The piano had seen better days. Its wood was chipped and faded. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them, and the whole thing was probably out of tune. But in Thomas's hands, it sang. Thomas himself looked like any other homeless person you might walk past without a second glance. His jacket was old and patched in several places. His jeans were worn thin at the knees. His gray hair fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with whatever string or rubber band he could find. His beard was long and unkempt, and his hands were rough from years of living on the streets. Deep lines carved through his face, telling stories of cold nights, hungry days, and a life that hadn't gone the way he'd planned. Most people just walked right past him. They'd drop a few coins in the dented coffee can at his feet without even breaking their stride. Maybe they'd feel good about themselves for a moment, thinking they'd done their good deed for the day, but they never really saw him. To them, he was just part of the city scenery, like a fire hydrant or a street lamp. But here's the thing about Thomas. The man could play. If you actually stopped and listened, really listened, you'd realize something was different about this street musician. He wasn't playing pop songs or familiar tunes that people could hum along to. He wasn't doing covers of radio hits to earn tips. Instead, his fingers moved across those yellowed keys with the kind of skill that takes decades to develop. He played classical pieces that most people had only heard in concert halls or fancy restaurants. Pieces that were supposed to be played on expensive grand pianos by musicians in tuxedos, not on broken street pianos by homeless men. His version of Chopin's nocturnes could stop people in their tracks. The way he played, it was like he was telling you a story without words. You could hear sadness in those notes, but also beauty. Sometimes people would stand there listening, and before they knew it, tears would be rolling down their cheeks. They didn't even know why they were crying. The music just reached inside them and touched something deep. When he played Rachmaninoff, it was even more incredible. Those pieces are technically difficult, full of complex runs and dramatic moments. Professional pianists practice for years to get them right. But Thomas played them like he was born to do it. Every note was exactly where it should be. Every crescendo hit just right. It was the kind of playing that made you wonder what this man's story was, how someone with this much talent ended up playing on a street corner. November came, and with it the cold. The city got that sharp bite in the air that cuts right through your clothes. People walked faster, trying to get to wherever they were going so they could get warm again. The wind whipped down the streets, making the fallen leaves dance in circles. On one particularly cold evening, as the sun was setting and the streetlights were flickering on, Thomas started playing something new, something different. This wasn't Chopin or Rachmaninoff or any of the classical masters. This was something people had never heard before. The melody was hauntingly beautiful. It started soft, almost like a whisper, like someone telling you a secret. Then it built slowly, adding layers of emotion with each passing phrase. There was sadness in it, yes, but not the kind that crushes you. It was more like the sadness of remembering something precious that you'd lost long ago. But mixed in with that sadness was something else. Hope, maybe, or longing, or the kind of bittersweet feeling you get when you look at old photographs. The music seemed to rise above all the noise of the city. Car horns, sirens, people talking on their phones, all of it just faded into the background. The melody floated through the air like it had a life of its own, reaching out to people walking by and pulling them closer. One by one, people started to stop. A businessman in an expensive suit paused mid-step. A young couple holding hands turned toward the sound. A woman carrying grocery bags set them down to listen. An elderly man with a cane found a nearby bench and sat down. Soon, there was a small crowd gathered around Thomas and his beaten-up piano, all of them captivated by this mysterious melody. Among the crowd was a woman named Jennifer Brooks. She worked as a music journalist for the city's main newspaper, and she'd been hearing stories about the piano man at Fifth and Market for months. Her colleagues at the paper would mention him in passing. "You should check out this homeless guy who plays classical music on the street," they'd say. "He's actually really good." Jennifer had been meaning to investigate for a while, but there was always another story, another deadline, another assignment. Finally, she'd decided to come see for herself what all the fuss was about. But she wasn't prepared for this. Jennifer pulled out her phone and started recording. Her hands were shaking slightly, and not from the cold. She'd been to countless concerts, interviewed famous musicians, reviewed performances at the best venues in the city. But there was something about this moment, this melody, this man playing on a broken piano in the cold, that hit differently. The song built to a climax, and then gently, softly came back down to earth. The final notes hung in the air for a moment before fading away completely. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was like everyone was afraid to break the spell. Then the crowd erupted in applause. People were wiping their eyes. Some were reaching for their wallets, stuffing bills into Thomas's coffee can instead of just coins. A few people shouted, "Bravo!" Like they were at the opera. Jennifer waited until the crowd started to thin out. She approached Thomas slowly, not wanting to startle him. Up close, she could see how the cold had turned his fingers red, how worn and tired he looked. "Excuse me?" she said gently. "That was incredible. What was that piece you just played?" Thomas looked up at her. His eyes were a pale blue, and they held something in them that Jennifer couldn't quite name. It wasn't just sadness or weariness. It was deeper than that. Those eyes looked like they'd seen things, lived through things, lost things that could never be replaced. He was quiet for a moment, his rough hands resting on the piano keys. Then he spoke, his voice rough from the cold but steady. "That's a melody that's been buried for 50 years, he said, "and it's time for it to come home." Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine, and this time it had nothing to do with the November wind. There was a story here, she could feel it. A big one. "The kind that could change everything. Can I ask you something?" she said, her journalist instincts kicking in. "Where did you learn to play like that? That's not just street musician playing. That's professional level. That's conservatory level." Thomas smiled slightly, but it was the saddest smile Jennifer had ever seen. "That's a long story," he said, "and it's not a happy one." "I've got time," Jennifer replied, and she meant it. She sat down on the cold concrete next to his piano, pulled her coat tighter around herself, and waited. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was serious or just another curious person who would lose interest and walk away. Then he took a deep breath, and Jennifer could see him steeling himself, preparing to open doors he'd kept locked for a very long time. "All right," he said finally, "but you might want to grab some coffee first. Like I said, it's a long story." Jennifer couldn't sleep that night. She kept playing the recording over and over on her phone, listening to that haunting melody. But it wasn't just the music that kept her awake. It was the look in Thomas's eyes when he said those words. A melody that's been buried for 50 years. What did that mean? And why did someone who could play like that end up living on the streets? The next morning, Jennifer showed up at 5th and Market Street with 2 large coffees and a bag of breakfast sandwiches. It was early, barely past sunrise, and the city was just starting to wake up. Thomas was already there, sitting on the ground next to his piano, wrapped in an old blanket. "Thought you might be hungry," Jennifer said, sitting down beside him and handing him a coffee. Thomas looked surprised, but he took the coffee gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around the warm cup. "You came back," he said. "I told you I had time," Jennifer replied, "and I meant it. Plus, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday, about that melody being buried for 50 years. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and staring out at the empty street. Finally, he spoke. "You know, people look at me now and they see a homeless man, a failure, someone who made bad choices or got unlucky. And maybe that's partly true, but I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I had everything, a future, a dream, a chance to make something of myself." Jennifer pulled out her notebook, but Thomas shook his head. "No writing yet. Just listen first. If you still want to write about it after, that's your choice." She put the notebook away and just listened. Thomas told her that 50 years ago he'd been a different person. Young, ambitious, full of hope. He'd gotten into Juilliard, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Getting accepted there was like winning the lottery for a young musician. Only the best of the best made it through those doors. "I was good," Thomas said, and there was no pride in his voice, just simple fact. "Really good. My teachers said I was a prodigy. I could play anything you put in front of me. Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. I absorbed it all like a sponge. But here's the thing, nobody tells you about being a prodigy. Being able to play other people's music perfectly doesn't mean you have something of your own to say." He explained that while he loved performing, his real passion was creating, composing, writing his own music. While his classmates were focused on perfecting their technique and landing performance gigs, Thomas was spending late nights in the practice rooms, writing his own pieces. "I'd stay up until 3, 4 in the morning sometimes," he said. "Just me and the piano and sheets of blank music paper. I was trying to create something that mattered, something that would outlive me, something that would make people feel what I felt." It took him years. Years of writing, erasing, rewriting, years of trying to capture the sounds he heard in his head and translate them onto paper. But finally, in 1975, he finished it. A complete symphony, his magnum opus. The piece he'd poured his heart and soul into. "That melody you heard yesterday," Thomas said, "that was the main theme, the heart of the whole thing. Every movement, every variation, it all came back to that theme. It was about loss and hope and the passage of time, about how beautiful things can be taken from us, but the memory of them, the essence of them, never really dies." Jennifer felt goosebumps on her arms. She could hear the emotion in his voice, even after all these years. Thomas told her he'd shopped his symphony around to various publishers. Most of them weren't interested. Original classical music was a hard sell, they said. Nobody wanted to take a risk on an unknown composer. But then he found someone who seemed different. The man's name was Richard Wainwright, and he ran a respected publishing company that specialized in classical music. Richard listened to Thomas play parts of the symphony and seemed genuinely impressed. He told Thomas this was exactly the kind of fresh, original work the classical world needed. He said he could get the piece published, maybe even performed by a major orchestra. This could launch Thomas's career as a composer. "I was so excited I could barely sleep," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly. This was it. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed about. It was finally happening. Richard drew up a contract. Thomas remembered sitting in that office, looking at all the official papers with the fancy letterhead. He was only 24 years old. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't really understand all the legal language, but Richard assured him it was standard stuff. "Just sign here and we'll take care of everything." So Thomas signed. He handed over his only complete manuscript of the symphony. Richard promised to be in touch soon with updates on the publication process. "That was the last time I saw him," Thomas said quietly. Weeks went by with no word. Thomas called the office repeatedly, but he kept getting vague answers from secretaries. Mr. Wainwright was in meetings. Mr. Wainwright was traveling. Mr. Wainwright would call him back soon. Months passed. Thomas's calls stopped being returned at all. He tried visiting the office, but security wouldn't let him up. He wrote letters that went unanswered. Then, about a year after he'd signed the contract, Thomas went to the office building one last time. But when he got there, the publishing company was gone. The entire floor was empty. Desks, filing cabinets, everything had been cleared out. There was a sign saying the space was available for lease. "I panicked," Thomas said. "I went to the building management, to other businesses in the building, asking if anyone knew where Wainwright went. Nobody knew anything. It was like the whole company had just vanished into thin air." Thomas tried everything he could think of. He went to the police, but they said it was a civil matter, not criminal. He tried to find a lawyer, but he couldn't afford one. He contacted the musicians' union, other publishers, anyone who might help. But the contract he'd signed had given away all his rights to the composition. Without the original manuscript or any way to prove he was the true composer, he had no legal standing. "I'd been so stupid," Thomas said, his voice heavy with old pain. "So naive. I'd given away the one thing that mattered most to me, and I had nothing to show for it. No published work, no career, no proof that I'd even created it. The loss broke something inside him. He fell into a deep depression. He stopped going to classes, stopped performing, stopped composing. What was the point? His best work, his life's work, had been stolen from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. He lost his scholarship, lost his apartment, started drinking to numb the pain. His friends from school tried to help at first, but eventually they moved on with their own lives and careers. Thomas drifted further and further down, until one day he realized he'd been living on the streets for a month and barely noticed the transition. That was 30 years ago, Thomas said. 30 years of wondering what happened to my symphony, wondering if Wainwright destroyed it or if it's sitting in some warehouse somewhere, gathering dust, wondering if anyone would ever hear it. I kept that melody in my head all these years because it was the only part of it I still owned. The only thing he couldn't take from me. Jennifer had tears running down her face. She hadn't even realized she was crying. "Why didn't you try again?" she asked. "Why didn't you compose something new?" Thomas looked at her with those sad, tired eyes. "You ever pour your whole heart into something? Everything you are, everything you dream of being, and then have it taken away? It's like..." He struggled to find the words. "It's like part of my soul was in that music. And when it disappeared, that part of me disappeared too. I couldn't create anymore. The well was dry." They sat in silence for a while, watching the city wake up around them. People started walking by, heading to work, caught up in their own lives and problems. Finally, Jennifer spoke. "Thomas, I'm a journalist. This is a story that needs to be told. Will you let me write about it?" Thomas shrugged. "Write what you want. It won't change anything. Wainwright is probably dead by now. The symphony is gone. It's all just ancient history." But Jennifer was already thinking ahead. She was thinking about archives, about records, about the paper trail that businesses leave behind even when they disappear. She was thinking that maybe, just maybe, ancient history wasn't as buried as Thomas thought. "Don't give up hope yet," she said. "Sometimes things that are lost can be found again. Sometimes justice comes late, but it still comes." Thomas just smiled that sad smile and started playing the piano. But Jennifer noticed something. Mixed in with the sadness of the melody, there was something else now. Something small, but definitely there. It was the faintest glimmer of hope. Jennifer went back to her office that day with a mission. She'd been a journalist for 15 years, and she knew how to dig for information. But this was different. This wasn't just another story. This felt personal. She started with the basics. Old newspaper archives, business records, anything she could find about Richard Wainwright and his publishing company from the 1970s. The internet made some things easier, but a lot of records from that era hadn't been digitized yet. That meant spending hours in the dusty basement archives of the city library, going through microfilm and old directories. After a week of searching, she found a few mentions. The company had been called Wainwright Classical Publishers. There were some small advertisements in music journals from the early 70s, a few listings in business directories. But then around 1976, all mentions just stopped. The company disappeared from the records completely, just like Thomas had said. Jennifer tried to track down Wainwright himself, but hit dead ends everywhere. No death certificate, no forwarding address, no social media presence, obviously, since this was decades before that existed. It was like the man had simply vanished, but Jennifer wasn't ready to give up. She'd promised Thomas she'd try, and she meant it. Even if she couldn't find the original manuscript or proof of what happened, she could at least tell his story. Maybe someone out there would remember something. Maybe someone had information that could help. She wrote up a draft of the article, detailing Thomas's incredible talent, his heartbreaking story, and the mystery of the stolen symphony. But something was missing. The story needed something more, something that would make people really pay attention. That's when she remembered the video on her phone. The recording of Thomas playing that haunting melody. Jennifer had an idea. It was a bit of a long shot, but in the age of the internet, sometimes long shots paid off. She created a simple video, combining the audio of Thomas playing with footage she'd shot of him at the piano. She added text overlay explaining the basic story and ending with a question. "Does anyone recognize this melody?" She posted it on the newspaper's social media accounts with the caption, "Mystery melody from a homeless virtuoso. This man claims this music was stolen from him 50 years ago. Can anyone help identify this piece?" Then she waited. At first, nothing happened. A few likes here and there. A couple of shares. Jennifer checked her phone obsessively, hoping for something, anything that might help. Then, on the third day, something changed. The video started getting more views, more shares. Comments started pouring in. People weren't just watching it, they were moved by it. Deeply moved. "This made me cry," one person wrote. "I don't even know why, but I can't stop listening to it." "This man is incredibly talented," another commented. "How is he living on the streets? This doesn't make sense. We need to find out what happened to him," someone else added. "This is heartbreaking." The video spread beyond the newspaper's followers. People started sharing it on their own pages, in music groups, in forums. Music teachers showed it to their students. Professional musicians started analyzing the melody in the comments, talking about its structure and emotional depth. Within a week, the video had 1 million views, then 5 million, then 10 million. Jennifer's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. News outlets from other cities were calling, wanting to interview her. Television producers wanted to do segments on Thomas. Record labels were reaching out, asking if he'd be interested in recording. But the most interesting messages came from musicians and music historians. They were fascinated by the melody itself. Several commented that it didn't match anything in the classical repertoire they knew. The composition style suggested it was from the 1970s, but nobody could identify it. If it really was an original composition from that era, and if there was more of it, this could be a significant discovery. One message in particular caught Jennifer's attention. It was from a woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, a musicologist who specialized in lost and forgotten compositions. She taught at a prestigious university and had spent her career tracking down music that had been lost to history. "This melody is extraordinary," Dr. Holloway wrote. "If there's truly a full symphony connected to this, it needs to be found. I'd like to help if I can. I have access to various archives and collections that might be useful." Jennifer called her immediately. Dr. Holloway turned out to be in her 60s, with a passion for music history that rivaled Thomas's passion for composing. She explained that over the years she'd helped locate numerous lost manuscripts, some of which had been missing for centuries. The 1970s era was particularly interesting to her because it was recent enough that records should exist, but old enough that many documents hadn't been properly archived. Publishing companies from that era often kept physical records, Dr. Holloway explained. Manuscripts, contracts, correspondence. When companies went out of business, those records had to go somewhere. Sometimes they ended up in university libraries or historical societies. Sometimes they were donated to music foundations. And sometimes they ended up in storage units or auction houses. She offered to start searching through her network of archives and collectors. Jennifer gave her all the information she had about Wainwright Classical Publishers and Richard Wainwright himself. Weeks went by. Jennifer visited Thomas regularly, bringing him food and updating him on the viral video and the investigation. At first, he seemed uncomfortable with all the attention. Strangers would recognize him on the street now thanks to the video. Some would stop and thank him for his music. Others would ask for autographs or selfies. It was overwhelming for someone who'd been invisible for so long. "I don't know if I want all this attention," Thomas told Jennifer one day. "What if we find nothing? What if it's all for nothing? Then I'll just be the sad homeless man everyone pitied for a while before they moved on to the next viral story." Jennifer understood his fear, but she also saw something changing in him. He was playing more confidently now. He was taking better care of himself. A local shelter had offered him a room after seeing the video, and he'd accepted. He was starting to hope again, even if he was afraid to admit it. Then, on a cold morning in December, Jennifer got the call she'd been waiting for. It was Dr. Holloway, and her voice was shaking with excitement. "Jennifer, I found something. You need to come see this right now." Jennifer drove to the university in record time. Dr. Holloway met her at the entrance to the music department's archive library. Her eyes were bright, and she was practically bouncing on her feet. "I've been going through acquisition records from a defunct auction house," Dr. Holloway explained as they walked. When businesses close down and their assets are liquidated, sometimes the contents end up being auctioned off in lots. I found a record from 1978 of an auction that included the contents of several closed businesses, including a publishing company. They reached a research room where several boxes were laid out on a large table. Dr. Holloway put on white archival gloves and carefully opened one of the boxes. Inside were stacks of old manuscripts yellowed with age, sheet music, contracts, business correspondence. Dr. Holloway carefully lifted out a thick bundle of papers held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. "This is it," she said softly, removing the rubber band with extreme care. "Look at the title page." Jennifer leaned in, her heart pounding. The paper was old and slightly brittle, but the handwriting was clear. At the top of the page, in neat script, it read, "Symphony in Lost Time, composed by T. Gray, 1975. T. Gray, Jennifer whispered. "Thomas Gray, oh my God!" Dr. Holloway carefully turned the pages. "It's complete." All four movements. "The entire symphony is here, but there was more." Tucked between the pages of the manuscript was a letter. Dr. Holloway carefully unfolded it, and they read it together. The letter was dated 1976, and it was from Richard Wainwright to someone named Andrew Wainwright, apparently his brother. Jennifer's hands shook as she read it. The letter laid out the entire scheme. Richard explained that he'd acquired a promising but naive young composer's work and planned to publish it under his nephew's name. His nephew was a mediocre musician who'd never compose anything worthwhile on his own, but Richard wanted to launch the boy's career. With this stolen symphony, he could make his nephew famous. But here's where the story took an unexpected turn. Attached to Richard's letter was a response from Andrew. The brother had been horrified by the plan. He wrote back refusing to be part of the scheme and threatening to expose Richard if he went through with it. There were several more letters back and forth, getting increasingly heated. In the final letter, Andrew threatened to go to the authorities. Soon after that correspondence, according to Dr. Holloway's research, Wainwright Classical Publishers had abruptly closed down. Richard Wainwright had disappeared, and the manuscripts had been seized and eventually auctioned off as part of bankruptcy proceedings. So the symphony was never published or performed because the scheme fell apart, Dr. Holloway said. "It's been sitting in storage for almost 50 years waiting to be discovered." Jennifer felt tears streaming down her face. After all these years, after all of Thomas's suffering, here was the proof. Proof that he'd composed something extraordinary. Proof that it had been stolen from him. Proof that he'd been telling the truth all along. "We need to tell Thomas," Jennifer said. "We need to tell him right now." As they carefully packed up the manuscript to take it somewhere secure, Jennifer thought about Thomas sitting on that street corner all these years, playing that melody over and over, keeping it alive in the only way he could. He'd said the melody had been buried for 50 years and it was time for it to come home. He had no idea how right he was. Jennifer drove straight from the university to the corner of 5th and Market Street. Her heart was racing so fast, she thought it might burst right out of her chest. In the passenger seat, carefully secured in a protective case, was a copy of Thomas's symphony. Dr. Holloway had insisted on keeping the original in the university's climate-controlled archive for safekeeping, but she'd made high-quality copies for Thomas to have. It was mid-afternoon, and Thomas was at his usual spot playing for the lunch crowd. Jennifer parked illegally, not even caring about getting a ticket. This couldn't wait. Thomas saw her coming and stopped playing. He could tell something was different by the way she was walking, almost running toward him. "We found it," Jennifer said, breathless. "Thomas, we found it. We found your symphony." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her like he didn't understand the words. Then his face went through a dozen different emotions at once. Disbelief, hope, fear, joy. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Jennifer sat down next to him and carefully opened the case. She pulled out the manuscript copies and placed them in his hands. Thomas looked down at the pages, at his own handwriting from 50 years ago. His hands started shaking so badly that Jennifer had to help him hold the papers steady. Tears began rolling down his weathered cheeks, falling onto the pages. "Is this real?" he whispered. "Tell me this is real." It's real, Jennifer said, her own voice breaking. It's all real. Your symphony exists. You didn't imagine it. It was there all along, waiting to be found. Thomas pulled the pages close to his chest and just sobbed. 50 years of pain, 50 years of doubt, 50 years of wondering if his greatest work had been destroyed or if he'd somehow imagined the whole thing. And now here it was, solid and real in his hands. People walking by stopped to stare, but neither Thomas nor Jennifer cared. This moment was too big, too important, too precious to worry about what anyone else thought. When Thomas finally composed himself enough to speak, he looked at Jennifer with wonder in his eyes. How? How did you find it? Jennifer told him everything. The viral video, Dr. Holloway, the auction house records, the letters revealing Wainwright's scheme and his brother's intervention. She showed him copies of the letters on her phone. Thomas read them in silence, his jaw clenched. When he finished, he let out a long, shaky breath. So he was going to steal it, really steal it. I wondered for so long if maybe I'd misunderstood something, if maybe there was some legitimate explanation. But no, he was just a thief. Yes, Jennifer said, but he didn't succeed. His brother stopped him. And now, 50 years later, justice is finally catching up. The story exploded even bigger than before. Jennifer's article about finding the lost symphony went viral just like the video had. News channels picked it up. It was on morning shows, evening news, late-night talk shows. Everyone wanted to know about the homeless pianist who'd been proven right after half a century. A team of lawyers came forward offering to help Thomas pro bono. They assured him that the contract he'd signed was fraudulent, and with the evidence from the letters, reclaiming his rights would be straightforward. The legal process took a few months, but eventually it was official. Thomas Gray was legally recognized as the sole composer of Symphony in Lost Time. During those months, Thomas's life changed in ways he'd never imagined possible. The same shelter that had given him a room upgraded him to a small apartment. Donations poured in from people who'd been touched by his story. Music stores sent him new clothes. A piano company offered him a beautiful grand piano for his apartment, but the most meaningful offers came from orchestras. Major symphonies from around the world contacted Thomas, all of them wanting the honor of performing the world premiere of his long-lost work. The New York Philharmonic, the Boston Symphony, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Even international orchestras from London, Berlin, and Vienna reached out. Thomas chose Carnegie Hall in New York for the premiere. It seemed fitting somehow. He'd been just a few miles away at Juilliard when he'd composed the symphony all those years ago. The preparation period was surreal for Thomas. He worked with conductors and musicians, people who treated him with respect and admiration instead of looking through him like he was invisible. He attended rehearsals, hearing his music played by world-class musicians for the first time ever. Sometimes he'd just sit in the empty concert hall during breaks, closing his eyes and listening, hardly believing this was really happening. You know what's strange? He told Jennifer one day. I spent 30 years on the streets and I thought I'd forgotten how to be a normal person. How to have conversations with people who see you as human. How to walk into a building and not have security ask you to leave. But it's coming back. I'm remembering who I used to be. Or maybe becoming someone new. I'm not sure which. Jennifer had been documenting everything for her ongoing series of articles. But more than that, she'd become Thomas's friend. She was there when he tried on his tuxedo for the premiere. She was there when he broke down crying after hearing the full orchestra play his symphony for the first time. She was there through all of it. The night of the premiere finally arrived. Carnegie Hall was packed. Every single seat was sold out, and scalpers were selling tickets outside for thousands of dollars. The audience wasn't just classical music fans. There were people from all walks of life who'd been following Thomas's story and wanted to be part of this moment. Backstage, Thomas was nervous, more nervous than he'd been in decades. He kept pacing back and forth, adjusting his bow tie, running his hands through his now neatly trimmed hair. What if it's not as good as I remember? He said to Jennifer. What if I built it up in my head all these years and it's actually mediocre? Thomas, Jennifer said firmly, taking his hands, Dr. Holloway has analyzed this symphony. Professional musicians have studied it. They all say it's extraordinary. Trust them. Trust yourself. Trust the music. When it was time, Thomas walked out onto the stage. The audience erupted in applause. It went on for minutes. People were standing, cheering, some crying. Thomas stood there taking it in. This moment he'd dreamed about for 50 years. He raised his hands for silence and then turned to face the orchestra. He'd chosen to conduct the premiere himself. The musicians looked at him with respect and readiness. Thomas raised the baton. The concert hall fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then he brought the baton down, and the symphony began. The opening notes were quiet, mysterious, like dawn breaking after a long night. Then the melody he'd played on the street corner emerged, but now it was supported by the full power of an orchestra. Strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, all working together to bring his vision to life. The music flowed through the hall. 50 years of emotion poured into every phrase. There were moments of profound sadness, yes, but also moments of unexpected joy. Passages that spoke of loss and longing, but also of resilience and hope. It was the story of Thomas's life in musical form, even though he'd composed it before he'd lived most of that life. As if somehow he'd known what was coming. The second movement was more aggressive, angry even. You could hear the betrayal in it, the injustice. The third movement was quiet and introspective, like someone sitting alone with their thoughts during the darkest night. And then the fourth movement brought it all together, taking that haunting main theme and transforming it. The melody that had sounded so sad when Thomas played it alone on a broken street piano now sounded triumphant, powerful, victorious. It was the same melody, but it had been through something. It had survived. It had endured. When the final note faded away, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the audience exploded. People leapt to their feet, applauding, shouting, crying. The ovation lasted for 15 minutes. Thomas stood there, tears streaming down his face, bowing again and again. The orchestra members stood and applauded him. Even the hard-bitten music critics in the audience were wiping their eyes. After the concert, at the reception, Thomas was surrounded by people. Musicians wanting to perform his work, record labels offering contracts, composers and conductors wanting to shake his hand. But Thomas made his way through the crowd to find Jennifer. "We did it," he said simply, hugging her. "We actually did it. The symphony was recorded and released. It became one of the most downloaded classical pieces of the year." Thomas suddenly had money, more than he knew what to do with. Royalties, performance fees, recording contracts. But here's the thing about Thomas. 30 years on the streets had taught him something important. He knew what it was like to be invisible, to be forgotten, to have a gift that nobody recognized. So he knew exactly what to do with his newfound wealth. He established the Lost Voices Foundation, dedicated to helping homeless artists and musicians. The foundation provided instruments, lessons, studio time, and housing support. Thomas personally interviewed every applicant, looking for that spark he recognized, that same passion for art that had kept him playing on street corners all those years. He also created a full scholarship program at Juilliard and other music schools, specifically for students who couldn't afford tuition. The scholarship came with legal support and mentorship, so no young composer would ever be taken advantage of the way Thomas had been. Thomas kept playing too, not because he needed the money anymore, but because he wanted to. Once a month, he'd go back to the corner of 5th and Market Street with his old beaten-up piano that someone had since donated to a museum. He'd play there for free like he used to. People would gather around, many of them knowing exactly who he was now, but he'd play for them just the same. "This corner was my home for a long time," he told a reporter who asked why he still came back. "These streets didn't give up on me, even when I'd almost given up on myself. I played that melody here for years, keeping it alive, and these sidewalks heard it. This is where my symphony survived. So yes, I come back. To remember. To honor that time. And to let other people who are struggling know that sometimes, even when everything seems lost, even when decades pass, sometimes your moment still comes." 3 years after the premiere, Thomas's second symphony was performed to similar acclaim. Turns out the well wasn't as dry as he'd thought. The creativity had just been waiting, dormant, for him to heal enough to access it again. Thomas never forgot those 30 years on the streets. He never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. And because he never forgot, he made sure that others wouldn't be forgotten either. His foundation helped hundreds of homeless artists get back on their feet, and several of them went on to have successful careers of their own. As for that haunting melody that started it all, it became one of the most recognizable pieces of modern classical music. People played it at weddings and funerals, in concert halls and coffee shops. It was featured in movies and commercials. Music students around the world learned to play it. But for Thomas, it would always be the melody that refused to die. The melody that survived betrayal, loss, and decades of silence. The melody that, in the end, brought him home.